All right, so this is our first little lesson. We're going to talk about shooting in manual. If you have any questions, just unmute yourself and you can jump in and let me know whatever you're thinking. So I'm going to try to make this quick. First things first, I kind of wanted to just give you a little words of encouragement, a quote here about photography. When words become unclear, I shall focus with photographs. When images become inadequate, I shall be content with silence. So when I read this quote, I just am constantly reminded about how our pictures, the main objective is to tell a story. And if our pictures aren't telling a story, then silence should be enough, basically. So we don't really need words to tell a story. Our pictures should be enough. So as we talk about like shooting in manual, there's a lot of nitty-gritty details about photography that as photographers, sometimes we get stuck up on, like posing and shooting a manual and making sure everyone's feeling comfortable, blah, 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 blah. But our main job is really to tell a story. So all this extra stuff is just extra, right? Our job is to tell the story. So that's where I wanted to focus us to start. Then we'll go ahead and get jumped into the basic features of manual, okay? The first three are the most important and probably the most important ones that you'll hear about from photographers that are trying to teach about manual, okay? So when you first start out, I'd really focus on the first three. If you're shooting in automatic, the camera's going to decide everything for you. You don't have any say about these top three. And bottom two, the camera would do also. So these are kind of things that you can adjust to make the photo more specific to what you're looking for instead of the camera just deciding. The first one, and this is the order I generally set my settings in. So I'll start with my ISO. Second, I go to aperture. Third, shutter speed, white balance, and then spot metering focus. So those are the five. The top three are probably the most important. Okay, so first up, ISO. I don't like big, long explanations. I couldn't even really tell you what ISO stands for, to be honest. In camera sensitivity, I don't know. But what I understand it is, and I hope that you do as well, is it's just fake light from the camera. The camera is guessing what kind of light or how much you want to add to your picture, okay? So if it's a really dark room, we can tell the camera, hey, it's dark. Make sure our pictures are brighter. Or we're outside, hey, it's really bright outside, the sun is out. Can you make our pictures not as bright? So basically the camera is just, it's fake light from the camera. So you don't need a flash, you don't need the sun or anything like that. The camera can just kind of adjust the light let into the camera. So if you're outside, I generally have my ISO between 100 and 200. If it's really bright outside, we're in the middle of the day taking pictures, it's usually at 100. And that's like if it's sunny outside. If it's cloudy, overcast, or maybe like later at night or closer to sunset, or the sun is kind of almost fully set, it's still hazy, it might be closer to 200 just to give it a little bit more light in the camera. Then if I'm inside, I generally in between 200 and 600. Your camera will go all the way up to like 10,000, maybe not like 8,000, I don't know, really high, okay? But once you start getting above 600, you're gonna see a lot more grain in your photos, which some photographers take as a very like artistic approach. And that's totally fine. If that's the way you wanna do it, of course, like go for it. You can also add grain to your photos in post-processing. So you don't necessarily, if that's your artistic approach, you don't have to shoot over 600 to get grain. In my situation, I try to stay below 600 because I don't like to add a bunch of grain to my photos. I think it makes them look a little less professional and more artistic, which is totally fine. But yeah, I like to avoid as much grain as possible. So if I have to go above 600, that usually means I need to add an external flash or add some type of lighting. Okay, so that's ISO. If you're outside, it's lower. If you're inside, it's higher. So in this picture, I wanted to give a couple examples. I was taking a picture in a really dark Catholic church of her wedding dress, and there was light coming in from these windows on the side here, but there wasn't any like, I mean, it was just like fluorescent lights from the church over here. So my ISO was at 400, which you don't see a ton of grain in this photo here. So then here's another example. This is the same wedding, actually. We were outside. It was a cloudy day. So we didn't have to use like shade from trees or anything. So my ISO was a little bit higher since it was cloudy. My ISO was at 160, but still close to that like 100 range when I was outside because of the sunlight, the natural light. There was plenty of lighting. Okay, so that's ISO. Aperture, number 2. So after I set my ISO, I know I'm inside shooting a ceremony, so that means I have to have a higher ISO. I'll move on to my aperture, okay? This, my silly definition and the logic here, how much is in focus and the depth of field, or like the depth of field. So that's more of a fancy word, like what's blurry in the background, okay? That's what aperture is, and how much you can see like in the front of the picture. So for a small group of people, usually like between 3 people or less, I am shooting like between a 1.2 and 2.8. 1.2, a lot of cameras won't get, or a lot of lenses, starter lenses won't get below 4. So once you get into higher lens quality, you're going to start getting like 1.4 is the smallest, 1.2 if you're really going to go crazy with an expensive lens. But a small group of people, if you're at 1.2, I would recommend like one person, because you're going to have like them very sharp and the background very blurry. Okay. If you're at like 2.8, you could have like 2 or 3 people where they're going to be really in focus and the black background's still going to be pretty blurry. So that would be a small group of people. On the other side, a large group of people, you can go from 2.8 to like 8.0. If you're going to do a landscape picture where you want like all these mountains in focus, you might be higher than 8.0, but I rarely go higher than 8.0 for like wedding day photos or family pictures or stuff like that. So if you have like 15 people in a family picture, you might be at like 7, 6, somewhere around there to make sure everyone's faces are in focus. But if you have like 4 or 5 people, you could probably stick around like the 3.2, 2.8 mark, depending on lighting situation. The other part of aperture you kind of have to think about, and it's kind of a little bit backwards to what you might think, when there's low light, so like when I was in that church and I'm shooting the picture of that dress, there's not a lot of light. If I lower my aperture and I'm only focusing on one thing instead of a bunch of things, I can have more light let into the camera so that it's brighter. Okay, so if you're in a situation with low light, you might want to decrease your aperture, but in effect, you're going to also get more blurriness on the sides and in the background. If you have lots of light, like outside, and you might have to increase your aperture just so that it's not as bright. But I generally, if you're outside, I would set your aperture to the size of the group and then worry about your shutter speed, which we're going to talk about next for the light variation. Okay, so far so good? Thumbs up? Okay, so back to the church picture. My ISO was at 400 because we were inside, and my aperture in this photo was at 1.4 because I needed more light into my camera, and I only really cared about focusing on the dress in this photo. So you can see that the dress is fully in focus. I didn't care about really anything else, so the sides are kind of blurry, but mostly because I wanted more light into my camera. That's why it was so low. Okay, for the outside photo, our ISO was at 160 and aperture was at 3.2, which is honestly for this group of people was probably a little bit low, but as you can see, most faces are in focus and it was kind of an artistic photo anyways. If I would have retaken this picture, I probably would have bumped it up to like 4.0, 5.0, something like that, just for a little bit more wholeness of the picture. Okay, the last one then of the important 3 is shutter speed. And this is how quick you take the picture and how long your shutter, the thing that actually opens and closes to capture the picture, is open. Okay, so that's just how quick the camera takes the picture. If you have low light, there's less motion. If there's no kids and it's just a family member like standing really still, you can have a lower shutter speed from like 1/125 to like 200, 1/200. And that's a pretty low shutter speed. So if you have people like walking or any type of movement, they might be blurry. So it's usually if people are standing still that you can be that slow of a shutter speed. If there's lots of light and more motion, people moving, you can go between 1/250 to like 4,000, 8,000. It depends on your camera, again, how high you can go. If you're at 1/8,000, it's probably like really bright outside. Usually when I'm outside, it's between like 600 to 2,000, somewhere in there on a sunny day. If I'm inside, like in a ceremony, I try not to go beneath 1/200, especially if I have people walking down the aisle towards me, because there's that motion again. And if my camera's closing slower, it doesn't grasp them fast enough. So they're going to move in the time that my camera closes. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's shutter speed. Back to the dress, ISO 400, aperture 1.4. My shutter speed was really low because I needed more light into that camera and there was no motion. So because it was dark in there, I could have my shutter speed lower to bring in more light. In the case of the outside picture, ISO 160, aperture 3.2, my shutter speed was 1/320. And that's because it was a little bit of a darker day outside. If it was full sun, it probably would have been like 600 to 1,000, somewhere in there. But because it wasn't as bright out that day, I could do a little bit lower aperture or shutter speed, sorry. Okay, those are the main three. The most important. The next ones we're going to get into are a little bit less important. And to be honest, sometimes I still even let them go on auto because it's a lot to think about. And these ones you can change in post-processing. So these are the top three to know: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Next one, white balance. This, you can tell your camera how warm or cool your setting is, okay? So if there's lots of browns in the picture, lots of old churches love the brown bricks, right? And the tan lights, nasty, right? It just looks tan and brown. In that case, you're gonna want a lower white balance, or in this case, Kelvin, as we call it, shooting in Kelvin. Between like 2,000 and 5,000 is usually where you're gonna, if it's really brown, you want to lower it so you get more blues in there, okay? And kind of like even out the white and blue, or the blue and brown balance. If there's lots of blues, so a church that I was shooting in a couple weekends ago, their walls were blue, and you'll see this shortly. Your white balance, you're going to probably want to add in more browns to kind of bring it back up towards, so we have a little more browns and blues, if that makes sense. This one, I really only adjust this one if I'm in a church that's really one or the other. If it's really brown or really blue, I will probably adjust my Kelvin. Otherwise, I usually leave it on auto because you can change it super easy in Lightroom. This is something that it's like, oh, if I shoot it way too brown, no problem. I can go back and adjust it in Lightroom. So I don't get too worried about this. You can't adjust aperture, ISO, and shutter speed after you take the photo. So those ones, they're set. But this one, whatever. Okay. So back to this photo. ISO 400, aperture 1.4, shutter speed 1/125. My Kelvin in this situation, because if you see, there was lots of browns in the background. This church had the brown brick and the brown walls and so my Kelvin was a lot lower. It was at 2,778. That's after I edited it. So I don't really know what I shot it at, to be honest. I'm pretty sure it was on auto. But when I delivered the edited image, it was at 2,000. So if you think about it, when you're taking the picture, you could always adjust your Kelvin lower instead of just letting the camera choose auto white balance, which I'm guilty of all the time. So, okay. This photo, however, was outside. There, I like to add, personally, I like a little bit more tans, get even skin tones and stuff. So this Kelvin was a little bit higher at 5,600, just to add in some more of the browns, because, you know, naturally the sky is blue. And if you want to add in a little bit more browns, you can adjust the Kelvin that way. So again, I'm sure this was shot in auto. I probably adjusted it in Lightroom before I sent it out. So that's white balance. Spot metering, last one. This tells the camera where you want to focus. A lot of cameras have like a sensor in them that picks for you, like, oh, I think that's a face, or I think that's an eye. So I'm going to focus there because I think that's a portrait of a picture of someone, okay? And that's really helpful when you first start because it'll decide where to focus and you don't have to really worry about that too much. When you start wanting to get more artistic, and in this case scenario, Like I was doing a first look. I wanted a picture of her in focus and him kind of blurry, as you can see here. So I put my spot metering on her face so that she would be in focus. If I were to do this in like an auto focusing mode, it probably would have focused on him because he's in front. But I wanted it to focus on her because that was the angle I kind of wanted to get. I want to get her expression before the first look. So the next photo then, I changed it up and I wanted him in focus and her to be blurry. So I adjusted my spot metering so that his face was the focus instead of hers. And this is probably the picture your camera would have taken at the settings I was at because he was in front of her, and the camera is generally going to choose his face because he's in front over her face. If you have a low aperture, remember aperture does the blurry background. So that's why it would choose him over her because he's more in front. Okay, so that's all 5. Let's practice now. I'm going to give you an image and I want you to guess what the ISO, aperture, shutter speed, and Kelvin is. You don't have to answer live. Just write it down or be thinking in your head, and then I'll give you the answers, okay? So here's the first photo. Let me tell you a little bit about it. It was a gloomy day, but we were outside, and it was a little bit blue because it was a stormy day, so the clouds were a little bit blue. So think of that in the Kelvin range. So maybe just kind of think through here. What would an ISO be if we're outside? Probably lower, hint, because there's more light. Aperture, because there's only 2 people, it could probably be lower. Shutter speed is probably going to be a little bit higher because we're outside and there's enough light. I don't have to lower it to get more light into the camera. And then Kelvin, it's probably going to be a little bit higher because there was already blues in the sky and I wanted to add more tans. Okay, so let's look. Got a good idea in your head? Okay, ISO was at 100 because I was outside. I probably could have done like 160, somewhere around there too. My aperture was at 2.2 because I wanted a little bit more of like the vines in the vineyard to be seen. I could have probably gone to 1.8 and it would have been blurrier in the background, but since I was a little bit further back, I opened up my aperture just a little bit to 2.2. And then my shutter speed was at 1/2500 because there was lots of sun, or there was enough sun. It was still gloomy, but there was enough sun and no shade in this location that I had lots of light coming in, so I could close my shutter faster with less light coming into the camera. And then, of course, my Kelvin was a little bit higher in my editing and my white balance because it was outside and I wanted to get a little bit more brown tones in there. One more to practice and then we'll be done. Okay, this is the church I was talking about. Blue walls, okay? It was dark in there. There was like, there were spotlights on them, but that was about it. And the spotlights were brown. So my ISO, since I was inside, I want the camera to bring out more light. So it's probably higher. Aperture, this one's tricky because there's a lot of people in here that we'd want in focus, right? So you might think, it's probably higher. Nope, because it was dark, I wanted it lower to get more light into my camera, okay? Same with my shutter speed. This one is probably lower because I need to it closes slower so that I let more light into the camera. And then Kelvin, this one's tricky because the walls were blue and the spotlights were brown. So it's a hard guess. Here were the settings. My ISO was at 500. And as you can see, there's a little bit of grain kind of between the people here. That's kind of when it starts to add a little bit of grain to your photos. My aperture was low, 1.8, because really I only cared about the 2 of them being in focus. I didn't really care about anybody else, but they were at about the same distance as the other 2. So they're pretty in focus still because they were about in the same location, according to the camera. My shutter speed was actually a little bit higher than I anticipated. If I would have guessed, I probably would have taken this at like 1/200 if I needed a lot more light in, but this one was at 320. And then Kelvin was like smack in the middle at 3000, just to kind of even out those blues and those browns. Okay, so questions. Do you guys have anything? You can jump in here. One of the things it's hard to teach is like where on your camera these settings are because every camera is different. So really like a quick Google search of like, how do I turn spot metering focus on my Canon 6 Mark III, whatever. Clearly I'm not a Canon owner. And so the quick Google search, and they'll show you the exact steps to take to adjust your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO, all those things. Or you can look in the manual, but who does that?
I have something to add.
Oh yeah.
In like really professional cameras, when you get full frame, usually you can adjust the Kelvin and like set it. Like I have mine set at I think 6300. Whereas in like the cheaper budget ones, I think you just set it as, you can't set an exact number. I don't think. I think it's just like sunny or cloudy. And so if you do get a cheaper one, I usually set it at cloudy, and that's usually like 6300 as well.
Yeah,
So.
that's a really good point. Yeah, it's probably only when you get to a more full frame camera that you can adjust the Kelvin. So yeah, that, and in the same way though, even if it's a cheaper camera and you're shooting in RAW, you can still adjust it in Lightroom later.
Yeah, you can do auto white balance on all.
Right. Yes, and that's another good note though, is you have to be shooting in RAW to be able to adjust the white balance in Kelvin in Lightroom. Okay, there still will be a white balance if you shoot in JPEG, but as a professional photographer taking more quality pictures, you want to be shooting in RAW too. And that's when a quick Google search, you can change all of your images into RAW. So good note. Thanks for saying that, Alexa. I kind of forget about the cheaper end of cameras. It's been a while since I looked at one. Okay, anything else? I'm just going to stop the recording here and then we can, stop sharing.